Hi, everyone. I'm Pastor Warren Hoyt, and talking again today about this book by Dr. Jay Richards, Money, Greed, and God, how capitalism is the solution and not the problem. Why is the pastor talking about a book on economics? Well, because I just think this book is terrific in the way it addresses issues that many today are confused about. We've been looking at the book, and I've done 3 chapters so far. I'm trying to go through all 8 chapters because in each chapter, Dr. Richards deals with a myth that he believes many of us have accepted regarding capitalism. So the first chapter was called The Nirvana Myth, the idea that folks today contrast capitalism not with the real world, but with some ideal out there that doesn't exist. The second chapter dealt with what's called the piety myth, where we focus on our good intentions rather than the unintended consequences of our actions. In the third chapter, Dr. Richards dealt with the zero-sum game myth, believing that trade requires a winner and a loser. And in this chapter, chapter 4, he deals with the materialist myth, which is believing that wealth isn't created, it's simply transferred. There's a hope more than that you'll read the book yourself, because there's just a wealth of information here that we all need. Chapter 4 begins with a quote from a guy I like, Mark Steyn. He's a Canadian writer. You often see him on Fox News or substituting for Rush Limbaugh. He said this: "Worrying is the way the responsible citizen of an advanced society demonstrates his virtue. He feels good about feeling bad." That's Mark Steyn, Steyn. As American Christians, we're very rich compared with the rest of the world. If everyone in the world were poor, that would be bad. But when some people are poor and others are rich, it makes the rich feel guilty. And we somehow feel that we're rich because we took from the poor. We have more because we took it from the people who have less. We constantly hear this kind of a refrain. And we hear about how unjust it is, for example, that there are still poor people in America. Liberal Christian Jim Wallis said, "God hates inequality." It's a common refrain. Winston Churchill said something Jay Richards quotes in the book, which I love. This quote, he says, "The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries." Great quote. Most of us, I think, except the millions who voted for Bernie Sanders, most of us, we know that socialist solutions are worse than the disease they try to cure. Still, many feel a nagging sense of unease because we have so much, and sort of feel like, we have more than our fair share, right? Don't we? It's not just the knowledge that some are rich and others are poor. The real concern is that one causes the other. Latin American theologian Gustavo Gutierrez actually says Latin America is poor because North America is so rich. Christian writer Ron Sider says today's global markets appear to create unjust, dangerous extremes between rich and poor. So, quote unquote, corrective action is needed. Who's going to take the corrective action? Probably means governments, right? Government should redistribute the wealth. The problem is that we have a wrong understanding of how the economy works. People imagine the wealth of the world like a big cherry pie. If some people cut great big slices for themselves, that means other people are going to get slimmer slices, right? Or maybe they won't get anything at all. So it's like a zero-sum game, but that's what chapter 3 was about. We already saw that that's not accurate. The truth is the pie's been getting bigger and bigger every year, and wealth is being produced. It doesn't just move from one owner to another. That's what we all need to understand, what Dr. Richards is trying to make clear in this book. Wealth is produced. It doesn't just move from one owner to another. Richards talks about some interesting statistics about the poor in America versus the poor of the world. And it's quite enlightening. The people in America who are classified as poor have a certain income and below, right? Well, they're poor, but they're relatively poor because he has all these statistics. 46% of them have, they actually own their own home. 76% have air conditioning. Only 6% are overcrowded. The average person that's poor in America has a larger living space than the average middle-class citizen in most of the world. Nearly 3/4 of the poor own a car. 30% of them own 2 or more cars. We have TVs, microwaves, all this. So they're poor relative to others in America, but it's not an absolute poverty. What's absolute poverty? Well, that's when you don't have enough to eat. You don't have enough clothes to keep warm or a shelter to get out of the rain. When you talk about absolute poverty, the statistics are really sad. 1/3 of deaths, some 18 million people a year, 50,000 a day, are due to poverty-related causes. Roughly, the population of the US has died since 1990, 300 million people due to that kind of cause, poverty. Every year, more than 10 million children die of hunger and preventable diseases, over 30,000 a day, 1 every 3 seconds. Over 1 billion people on Earth live on less than $1 a day. Some 2.8 billion live on less than $2 a day. 600 million children live in absolute poverty. The 3 richest people in the world control more wealth than all 600 million people living in the world's poorest countries. So this is absolute poverty, and it highlights the tremendous gap that exists between rich and poor. It sounds terrible. It's something God's concerned about. We should all want to help these poor people. However, in the list of things that Richards gave there, he says one of them is not like the other. Remember the Sesame Street jingle? One of these things is not like the other. Well, one of them isn't. The 3 richest people in the world control more wealth than 600 million people living in the world's poorest countries. That's not like the other statements, because it's not just a fact, it's a comparison. And it conveys the idea that somehow these 3 guys are rich because the others are poor. You see that? The 3 that control the most wealth, they're rich because somehow they're taking from the poor. Here's what Richard says about that. Complaints about gaps almost always reflect a basic confusion about the nature of wealth. It's a basic confusion about the nature of wealth. That's why this book is so good. When we hear the gap has grown, we're supposed to think that the rich are getting richer because they're making the poor get poorer. But you see, that's only true if the amount of wealth is static, and that's not the case. The economy isn't a zero-sum game. That's what we looked at in chapter 3. To illustrate what he's talking about, Richards talks about this imaginary country called Atlantis. He says, okay, there's 1,000 citizens in Atlantis. 10 years ago, 999 Atlanteans had incomes of $1,000 a year. One fat cat Atlantean made $1 million a year, 1,000 times what everybody else made. Well, what if we heard that in the last 10 years, the income gap had grown tenfold? That would be terrible, right? But only if you assume it's because the fat cat got richer at everyone else's expense. If you don't have any further info, it would really sound bad. But what if you found out that now the 999 people make 10,000 a year and the rich guy makes 100 million? Sure, the gap has grown tenfold, but guess what? The 999 people are making 10 times more than they made 10 years ago. They're actually better off. So you have this gap, and it's gotten bigger, but it isn't because the rich guy took from the poor. The poor people are better off too. It's because the economy isn't a pie that remains the same size. It grows. And the wording of things is really telling as well. Saying that the 3 richest men control more than the 600 million poorest people, that sounds really bad. They control the wealth, these rich men, they're bad. Well, what if you said they've created more wealth than the 600 million poorest people? Well, that doesn't sound as bad at all, does it? It frames the problem in different terms. So then the concern becomes not why these 3 guys have so much more than the others, but rather the concern is, how come these others have been able to create so little wealth? That changes the whole nature of our thinking. See, the relevant issue isn't whether there's any kind of gap or whether that gap has grown. The relevant issue is whether or not the poor people's situation is improving. Listen to this. It's very, very illustrative of what we're talking about. From 1947 to 2005, the average income of the richest 20% of the US population went up almost every year, from 8,000 something in 47 to 184,500 in 2005, adjusted for inflation. But you know what? That increase didn't come at the expense of the poor at all. On the contrary, the incomes of the poorest 20% also went up every year from 1584 to 25,616 in that same time period. And all of this happened while the population doubled. So the total amount of wealth went up. The rich didn't get rich by making the poor poorer. Everybody got richer. And some of the poor actually moved up the ladder and they're no longer classified as poor because upward mobility is a real possibility in our system, capitalist system. Richards talks about a website you can go to, and I want to mention it here. It's called gapminder.org. You ought to go there and check it out. There's this cool graphic there, gapminder.org. And you click play there, and it shows you how societies in the world have changed economically over the years, and they're all moving up except for some. Every country, every people group tends to prosper and create more wealth, and things get better over time, except where there are dictatorships or government-controlled countries without the basic foundation for prosperity. Comparing countries, there's one unmistakable trend. Countries with the rule of law and economic freedom prosper over time. Countries without these virtues do not. See, the point of the chapter is the total amount of wealth increases over time. Why? Because wealth is not just material, but spiritual. Now you might say, well, that's weird. What do you mean wealth is spiritual? Well, to create wealth, that takes creativity, initiative. It has to do with our beliefs. It has to do with values. It has to do with things like law and order and so forth. Richard says wealth isn't about stuff, it's about us. At the heart of economics, then, is a reality that exists not in material objects, but in our individual and collective minds. Think about it, even money itself isn't material per se, it's just paper. The only reason it has value is because a lot of us believe that it has value. So it's not totally material. So again, the myth Richards is dealing with in chapter 4 is the materialist myth, believing that wealth isn't created but simply transferred. And so to disprove this, he shows how wealth has been created over human history. Think about it. In the beginning, all human beings were subsistence farmers. We barely could survive, scratch out an existence out of the dirt. But over centuries of time, what's happened? We've learned new techniques, we've developed new tools, new technologies. All of this has allowed us to create all sorts of things, from plowshares to fertilizer, tractors, banks, credit. All these developments have enabled us to expand wealth astronomically. There's so much more available now than there was in our past. And we can even create more and more wealth with less and less matter. For example, Richards uses the example of fiber optic cable. You use like 60 pounds of silica sand, cheap sand, and you can make a fiber optic cable that carries thousands of times more information than a 2,000-pound cable made of expensive copper. See, we're creating more and more through the mind, through creativity, the human spirit, and so forth. Think about food production. It's another great example. It used to be everybody had to farm. Now only 1.9% of the American population farms. Yet that 1.9% produces more food than we need for our whole country. They sell it, export it to other countries because they produce more. Agriculture has gotten more effective, more efficient, greater. Around the very end of the 19th century, there was a guy named Charles H. Duell, who was commissioner of the U.S. Patent Office, and he announced, quote, "Everything that can be invented has now been invented," unquote. Can you imagine how funny that is? He thought everything had already been invented by the end of the 19th century. In 1870, 15,000 patents were granted every year for new things, but today the average exceeds 150,000. Think of the developments that we're seeing. I mean, just take computers alone. Your computer is obsolete in 2-3 years. You got to move up because everything is growing exponentially and getting far beyond what we even imagine. I mean, our phones today, they're computers that can do more than our desktop computer used to be able to do. So if you think about it, looking at our past history, there's no reason not to believe that wealth will just continue to increase in unlimited fashion. The only thing that hinders that is dictatorship, repression, chaos, war, things like that. It's all that thwarts prosperity. I've been reading another book by Dr. Rodney Stark about the history of capitalism. It's very interesting. He mentioned Spain. You know, Spain was the richest empire there for a time after Columbus came to America. And the Spanish were importing gold and silver, you know, and it made them rich for a while. But Spain never did build up to become a long-lasting, prosperous empire. And Dr. Rodney Stark says it's because of their policies. They didn't build up a middle class. They didn't allow people to create business and to create wealth. They ran it top down, and government policies caused Spain to roll. I mean, they're not the same at all anymore. They're diminished on the world scene because of their policies. So that's why this economic theory stuff is really important. It affects how we live. Now, why do Americans believe in equality? Well, Thomas Jefferson, you know, he said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. Actually, though, if you look around, all men are not created equal. Some are tall, some are short, some are fat, some are skinny, some are black, some are white. You know, who said we're created equal? Obviously, Jefferson didn't mean physically. He just meant that one God created us all, so we all had rights because of that. But we all tend to link inequality of outcome or opportunity with injustice. If everybody doesn't make the same amount of money, it's unjust. Really, folks, that's not true. It's just not true. Listen, God doesn't make everything equal. I'm here in Florida where it rains a lot. I have a son in Oregon where it rains a lot. But in El Paso, it rains very little. Why? It's not equal. How come some places are rainy and some places are desert? How come some places are warm and some places are cold? God didn't create equality. How come some people have more of a certain ability than others? I can't play basketball like Michael Jordan. Hello? God is not about equality in that kind of term. And if he can be just without sharing his blessings equally, might the same be true for society? Yeah, I think so. Some, even Christians, think it's wrong and dangerous for wealth to be concentrated in the hands of a minority. So they say, what are we going to do about this? And they think, well, we need to change the government. We need Bernie Sanders. We need socialism. We need to raise the minimum wage. We need to bring equality so everybody can make the same. The government will have to do it. They can redistribute the wealth by force. Guys, that's not a wise policy. Number one, it's unjust. You're taking from people and you're going to ruin their initiative. They're not going to do anything. It's been proven over and over. If you take from people who work hard, they'll just stop working hard, or they'll just hide what they make, or they'll just put it somewhere else. It's not wise policy. And the thing is, if you say, well, look, I want to take money from this minority of, 10, 20%, 10% or whatever it is that control the wealth, and we need to control that and not have a minority have it. So what are you going to do? You're going to give it to the minority that's called the US government? And you think that they're going to do a better job handling it? Listen, Richard says this, I thought it was great. He says there's a lot of things that governments can't do, but one thing that governments have proven over and over is that they can very definitely create poverty very well. I mentioned Spain. I mentioned the Soviet Union. Hello, governments are good at creating poverty. Lots of left-leaning people think we should just tax the rich disproportionately and take all their wealth and give it to the poor. Hello, that's not a wise policy. The truth is, hey, the rich already pay most of the taxes. Do we realize that? Not only so, but like I say, you take from these people and give to the government, you think they're going to do a better job, a more just job? Listen, the corruption that's in the government, the inefficiency, the ineffectiveness, not the way to go. And by the way, that's why some people have said democracies can't exist long. Because as soon as voters realize they can vote to put people into office who will give them more, and as soon as politicians realize they can get elected by promising more, the whole system begins to collapse. Folks, I'm afraid that's exactly what's happening in America. People are not thinking right about these things. And loose fiscal policy is usually what brings democracies down. Think about it. Not just an outside invader or a war or something like that. Loose fiscal policy can destroy a democracy. That's why this book is so important. That's why I'm talking about it. Listen to this quote from Richards. How long can a society exist once a majority discovers it can vote to have the state confiscate the wealth of a minority and give it to them? How long? Bill Gates told the graduate that economic inequality was a moral outrage and that reducing inequity, human achievement. Jim Wallace, that liberal Christian I mentioned earlier, he's complained that the greatest crisis of American democracy today is the division of wealth. Jay Richards says, you know what? Nonsense. That's nonsense. If these things they're saying were true, we should hate Bill Gates. We should be up in arms and just be seething in anger because he has more than us. That's just hand-wringing. It's complaining. It's ungodly. And guess what? It doesn't address the real problem. It doesn't solve any problem. All it does is stir up discontent, and it focuses attention on the wrong issue entirely. Even in the kingdom of God, there will be inequality, but there won't be poverty. Did you know that? In the kingdom of God, not everybody will receive the same, but we won't be jealous or envious or anything like that. I got to end, but let me read one final quote to you from Dr. Richards. Such a good quote. He says, until a few centuries ago, most Europeans were as dirt poor as many in the third world today. Historically, our current pockets of prosperity are highly unusual. We rightly see poverty as a problem, just as disease is a problem. But the problem isn't that some people are rich and some are poor, any more than the problem of disease is that some people are healthy. The problem is quite simply that some are poor. If we want to bask in the wasteful heat of self-righteous moral indignation, then by all means, let's keep blathering on about income gaps. But if we really want to help the poor, we need to get our eyes off decoys and focus on the real problem, poverty, and its only known solution, creating wealth. Wise words from Dr. Jay Richards. Again, the book, Money, Greed, and God. That was chapter 4. Hope you'll tune in again for chapter 5 next time. Hope you'll get the book and read it and share it with your friends. Until then, it's good to have been with you. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.